welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Joining me online tonight is my good friend, Neil of the Servants of the Sacred Fire. How are you, buddy?
I'm doing good. Got me a nice cup of tea tonight.
All right. So let me ask you a question, Neil. A Mormon, a Baptist walking into a bar, what happens next?
A lot of confusion.
A lot of confusion. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to pick on our good friend Glenn Beck a little bit more as
he's my favorite.
Oh geez. The poor guy is so lost. I gotta tell you. All right, let's start with this. Glenn Beck does an interview here with a gentleman called Voddie Baucham, right? Who is a Baptist pastor down south somewhere, right? And the conversation entails how everything is collapsing morally and spiritually, and how America is collapsing, and how Christianity now in America has been consumed by wokeism. And essentially, Neil, they're arguing this is not good, this is bad, America's collapsing, the trajectory is terrible. If this doesn't change soon, we're going to be in a state of moral chaos in America. And this is something you hear a lot from a lot of people, including us here. We've addressed these issues here, me and you, for many years, about the moral demise of America and really the West at this point in time. But I think with us Catholics, we have a fine history and a tradition that has been labeling, or at least tracking, the progressive nature of this collapse for several hundred years. But our friends on the right, especially the classical liberals and the Protestants, who have kind of been all over the map in regards to not only theology, but culture and society, especially with all these contradicting Protestant views in America. It appears to me, in a Protestant nation like America, founded off the principles of freedom, liberty, that these contradictions are coming home to roost. As you know, we're more integralist-minded thinkers that have been warning everybody, including classical liberals, this civilization is off kilter. You're not going to get it back on course by simply screaming, Founding Fathers, Constitution, freedom, liberty. There is a moral crisis that goes back at least to the Protestant Reformation, and the relativism that has been embraced by American Protestantism, I believe, is at the core root of this moral crisis destroying America today. But for some reason, Mr. Beck and his guests on there, who I believe are good and decent people, they mean well, but it's amazing to watch Protestants trip all over themselves as the problems, in my opinion, that they've created with their indifferentism and their problematic principle of religious liberty is now taking America to a destructive end. Neil, I know you watched this interview. What were your thoughts?
My thinking was pretty much down the same line that you're going with. When I was listening to it, and Glenn and his guests, they were talking about how the country's gone insane and how pedophiles are becoming accepted as minor attracted people. And, they're kind of going down a list of things. Glenn throws in that, 10 years ago, we knew that was wrong, and I didn't change, he says. You changed, being society, you changed. But the thing is, what he fails to realize is that it's Glenn who believes in the absolute right of freedom of religion and freedom of expression. He believes you can do as you like, just don't do it to me or my kids, right? He doesn't realize that belief system, when you allow for that kind of license, then you end up with moral relativism. You end up with these disordered attractions finding acceptance and normalization, and then they act on those attractions. And it's the beliefs that people like Glenn have that allow for this stuff to happen. They allow for it to be normalized because he's got this idea, this libertarian idea of, just don't cross my property lines. But it's like, by having that opinion, that belief system, you are allowing it to fester and grow. You are silently normalizing it. By your silence, you're normalizing it. You're saying this is just a natural part of society. I don't like it myself. I'm not going to look at it. I'm going to cover my eyes, but it's natural for society. It's normal. Just don't look at them, honey. Just, well, that kind of thing. But it's like, if it is normal, then if it's not to be condemned, then why wouldn't it spread to your kids, to your schools, to your society, to your government? Why not? I mean, I don't say, listen, marriage, between a man and a woman, right? I don't look at that and go, that needs to not be spread. Okay. No, because we know that's a natural part of human nature. Okay. So it's okay if that spreads and catches on, you could say, right? It's treated as normal. But when you take all these other things and do that, you can't then sit in an interview and go, I just don't know. I mean, heck, we had these principles of you do what you want to do and I'll do what I do. I don't understand what went wrong.
Yeah, I think, one of the things we knew after the Oberfeld decision was passed, legalizing gay marriage in America, was the idea that now that it's accepted by law and as a norm, that this behavior or these forms of relationships and these sorts of attractions would increase in scope, simply because the stigma against it has been torn down by the government. It's not an act of shame anymore, and so now people are more free without the discouragement of cultural values and cultural mores to partake of this act right here. It will become more normal. It's the same thing here with Mr. Beck and how he kind of approaches this, where he takes, like you said, a libertarian-esque approach to morality. Listen, I know what these people are doing is wrong, but I can't really judge them because my church is different than their personal beliefs, and I really can't interfere with somebody else's freedom. Because as we talked about Beck before, like with pornography, right? He would argue that we can't ban pornography because the freedom God gives us is actually a greater moral principle than the sin God condemns. So pornography is bad. Pornography is destructive. Pornography destroys the minds of young men and young ladies. But in the name of freedom and liberty, we have to allow porn to exist and simply, work through it, right? Engage in the battle arena of ideas to win hearts and minds. But Neil, as we know, one, God doesn't teach a form of freedom that equates license. And number two, if you allow these disorders like pornography, for example, to just coexist without any moral condemnation of it, these things will fester and will become destructive, and people will react based upon, what they're watching on their phones or their televisions. Right, Neil?
Yeah. And, do we have, I think, all Christians, by all Christians, I mean Christian churches, whether it be Catholic or Mormon, well, Mormons aren't Christians, but Baptist, Protestant, whatever, we all buy into this idea that, well, if we just portray the truth to society, right? We say, here it is. That when man looks at the truth and then looks at what is sinful, well, the truth will always win. We're always going to choose the truth, which is completely naive and ignorant.
And wrong. I mean,
yeah, it's wrong. Adam and Eve were perfect. They had no sin. And when presented with the slightest temptation to evil, they took it as quickly as the serpent could speak. Okay. And now we're fallen. So we have something that Adam and Eve didn't have to worry about. We have concupiscence. We have that natural inclination to sin. And we have the world and the devil on top of that to deal with. So you mean to tell me that, well, as long as you just present the gospel, just present the good news of Jesus Christ, your personal Lord and Savior, that we're just naturally going to choose that over all the sex I could possibly want? Are you kidding me? My passions are so driven towards pleasure that it's grace It's grace that leads me to self-mastery and to choose the gospel and the truth. That's why we used to have a society, what they would call Christian nationalism, which we call Christendom, all right,
Yep.
that made an endeavor to help the human person choose the good by not allowing certain vices and evils to be legal within a kingdom,
Mhm.
by having a national church, religion, the Catholic Church, right? Unified us under a single moral conscience, all right? Moral principles that we knew, right? Like they would complain about in the video. Well, it used to be we knew right and wrong. Yeah, under Christendom, we knew this is what the church taught. This was right. That was wrong. Until your Protestant people came along, revolted against the church
Yeah.
and the throne, and dissolved it.
See, that's what's interesting, because the Protestants, like Mr. Beck and Mr. Bockham here, they will look back in history and say, okay, this is the greatest civilization ever known because of Christianity. But Neil, the greatness of Christianity was within the realm of Christendom.
Mm-hmm.
And it was under the leadership of monarchy.
Yeah.
If you look at the West, the greatness of the West was raised in the midst of monarchical Catholic society. The collapse of the West has happened under the very same principles that Mr. Beck has espoused, and that is under liberal democratic governments.
Enlightenment principles.
Enlightenment principles, right? So this disconnect is huge here, right? Because we've seen all of this really come apart now over the past 250 years since the Enlightenment. Now, I think what Mr. Beck will refer to, if you go back in American history, 100, 150 years ago, that America was a Christian nation built off the principles of the Bible. Well, okay, let's stop right there. First of all, for being honest, we could say that the moral depravity of the West, it begins at both the American and the French Revolution. The French Revolution hits Europe very hard and very adversely, man. I mean, it hits it hard, right? But Europe, geographically speaking, the way it's constructed, first of all, much smaller, and two, civilized for a couple thousand years with a lot less rural territory than America, a new nation with no past, no roots. In America, really, for the first 100 years before the Industrial Revolution, roughly, right? Really, what, 80, call it 80 years, you could find a little enclave, a little corner in this rural land and kind of hide out and do your own thing. And nobody was essentially bothered. It's why the Mormons ran out to Utah starting in the 1830s. And really nobody bothered them until modern travel and modern communications really came about. But Europe was much more civilized, much smaller geographically. It wasn't as rural as America. And so the French Revolution adversely affects Europe a lot faster and really a lot harder. But really, the moment industrialization happens in America and we get mass travel and mass communications, I mean, what, by the early 1900s, that's it. You're seeing Protestants start to surrender on contraception, on divorce and remarriage. They're surrendering on everything, essentially. So again, I don't know what this Christian America actually really is in many ways, because the moment they have to, how should I put this, engage on a more macro scale with society, America begins to fall morally almost immediately, Neil.
Yeah, I mean, when they say Christian, I've gathered that they are mostly referring to the personal beliefs of the founders and the people of the country. Now, I've also saw him do an interview with the historian Barton, I think it is, and
Yeah.
he tries to pull out different ideas that there is in the documents that is somehow Christian in their beliefs. If we're going to say that the founders were Christian and that the people in America were Christian, I can buy that. When you start to say that the government the America is founded as a Christian nation, I question that more, because Jesus is not anywhere in the documents. All right. The social kingship of Christ, not in the documents. All right. You can interpret the documents through a Christian lens to a certain degree if you want to, but so can a Muslim. A Muslim could translate it as Allah if he wanted to, right?
Well, but the argument would be is that if you read the Constitution and Declaration and all the documents of the founding, you will see the Bible in those documents, and the founders purposely put those phrases or those Bible quotes or something that relates back to the Bible in the document, which makes America, I guess, a Protestant integralist nation, Neil.
Well, first off, no, because these particular founders did not agree on what exactly the Bible is. I mean, you had Thomas Jefferson tearing up the Bible and making his own version of it. Washington had his own ideas as to what Scripture taught and what it didn't teach. They were all kind of their own little popes as far as what they believed about the Bible and their own interpretations of it. But that's my point, is that it's vague. You can look at it and go, these are scriptural documents. I look at it and go, well, it looks pretty secular to me. The Muslim, like I said, can go, well, I don't know, I see the handwriting of the Quran in here. They can all interpret it however they want, depending on what lens you're using. And on top of that, if they say that, if Glenn Beck says that, he's talking out of both sides of his mouth. Because first, we don't have a national religion. We are a free society and freedom of religion and freedom of expression, blah, blah, blah. And then on the other side of his mouth, he's going, well, we're a Christian nation. We're founded with Christian ideas and Christian principles.
I know.
Which one is it, buddy? You can't have it both. All right. So I think there's contradicting himself if he's going on about that, or at least he's talking out of both sides of his mouth when he tries to make that claim. But like I said, I don't personally believe that the United States, the government, is a Christian founding, like the documents and everything are somehow Christian. It is people who are Christian wrote those documents and may have indeed included some scripture verses to back up what they're saying. But that does not automatically make it a Christian nation, a Christian government, just because you use some Bible. For Hitler used Bible, I'm sure. Hitler tried to use religion to get what he wanted,
Yeah.
He doesn't make him a Christian.
Yeah.
Not that the founders are Hitler, by the way. Not completely different.
No. But everything Hitler did, he borrowed from Mussolini, who he saw as an idol, which is another discussion in itself. He used Christian imagery. That's the point there.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that they address in this video, and what is disturbing to them, and it should be disturbing to everybody, is how this wokeism now has really taken over Christianity in many ways, and how wokeism now dominates really the culture at this point in history. And as a guy who's been on record now for over 2 decades on social media, fighting the culture wars and warning people a long time ago, and I don't toot my horn too often, but I've been right on almost everything. I've been advising classical liberals that it is their very principles, along with Protestantism, that has helped facilitate a lot of this wokeism because of the indifferentism that classical liberals have accepted and the relativism of sola scriptura Protestantism. So now that the Protestants see, wait a minute, we got all this disorder all over the place. We got a bunch of, purple-haired feather duster leading this crazy woke revolution. And my thing is, okay, but you guys allow for divorce and remarriage. You guys allow for contraception as a form of freedom. You guys allow for pornography. You guys allow for all these disorders. And now that these disorders have been entangled within the mix of the culture and destroy the family, that has led to an even more extreme elements of these disorders through individuals now in our society. How can you even talk and complain how everything has gone wrong? You never fought the fight to begin with, because you use sola scriptura in a way where you could justify certain sins. Sure, you might not have gone as far as, okay, killing babies and abortion. but you set up the conditions through
Yeah.
what in Christendom, right, were always considered sins. But in the New World, under the guise of sola scriptura, some of these things weren't considered sins anymore. And these disorders now have played out in our culture. And now you want to say how everybody's gone, excuse my language, batshit crazy? I'm just dumbfounded.
Yeah, well, look, y'all wanted so-called freedom. I keep saying that because it's license, really. It's not freedom.
Yeah.
True freedom, is the ability to do what you ought to do, right? To seek the true and the good and the beautiful. It is not an acceptance of error, all right? But they wanted this radical freedom, this license. Well, you got it now, buddy.
Yeah.
You got it. All right. You wanted revolution, remember? Got to revolt against authority. Got to revolt against the church. Got to revolt against the king. Well, guess what? Now they're revolting against you. Your children are revolted against you. All right. Your liberalism gave birth to their liberalism, and they're living it out. So who are you to now complain? And by the way, when we were mentioning the founders, I just remembered something that came to my mind when they saying it was, Christian and everything. A huge inspiration to them was John Locke, who is notoriously anti-Catholic.
Yeah.
So there's certainly a thread of anti-Catholicism in those Enlightenment and John Lockean principles. Because and also the guest kind of mentioned, well, it's here in the States that Catholics and Mormons and all could all, come together or worship however they want. And I'm like, hold on. And when it first founded, a lot of anti-Catholic sentiments there.
Yeah.
That came along later when we took over the culture more. Of course, we've also lost that culture now, but
sure.
Still.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things they mentioned here, let me check my notes here. And you alluded to this when we started the cast, but they started making fun of the idea of Christian nationalism, right?
Yeah.
Because I guess liberals and progressives are coming out, using the Christian nationalism term in a negative connotation. And Beck's response to his guest was, Christian nationalism? Who believes in that? Who believes in that, right?
He called it nonsense.
Nonsense, right? Well, for the record, I'm a Christian nationalist.
Yeah.
I'm an integralist.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, hail Christendom. Bring it all back. That's what I say. Okay?
Deus Vult.
So it exists, Glenn. You may not like the term because you're being boxed in. I get that. But I think it's hilarious. And it goes back to what I said. When Christian nationalism, if you want to call it, I call it Christendom, reigned, and there was a symbiotic relationship between the church and culture and governments, Christianity worked. Culture was a lot healthier. The family was strong. We didn't have these disorders. We weren't murdering our children in the womb. We didn't have the disordered life. We didn't have this transgender stuff. We didn't have kids cutting off their penises in that world, Neil. Yeah. So, excuse me, if I want to go back to something that actually worked, my friend.
Yeah, and I know they're going to point out the weaknesses of the Middle Ages or Dark Ages or whatever. There's a lot of good to be said, by the way, that people misinterpret. They claim it was so awful, but there was a lot of freaking good that was going on in the Middle Ages.
A lot.
But you know what? I'll concede that there was also some bad stuff, maybe even a lot of bad stuff that happened that went on. But who's to say that Catholic integralist culture we call Christendom, if allowed to exist today, if it had continued, all right, would not be far superior morally, financially, economically, militarily, whatever way, than what we have now?
Yeah.
Because see, we're looking at it and comparing it to our 21st century eyes. We're comparing it to the technologically advanced United States of America, who has its economic clause and everything, all right? And we're saying, look how awesome we are, all right? But you're doing so by standing on the ashes of Christendom that came before it. And then you're condemning those Christendom. You're condemning it as, so barbaric. There were slaves. There were this and that. It's like, but you're applying your 21st century eyes to that, judging it, and not realizing, had it been allowed to continue, the bad that was there more than likely would have been exercised. And we would have advanced. Okay, and probably superior to what we have now.
Well, what's even worse, and what they never give Christendom credit for, is that the entire European continent had to be evangelized.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, it was a pagan continent. The classical liberals never had to worry about that little problem, which wasn't so little. The Catholic Church had to worry about the problem of converting a pagan nation, which was very difficult. And at times, there was a lot of tough moral decisions to make when you're dealing with a bunch of pagans.
Mm-hmm.
The classical liberals took over a great civilization handed to them by the Catholic Church. And for that, we're never been given credit for that. We're made a fun of, because this is the Monday morning quarterbacking, the armchair quarterbacking that we do as historians. And as I'm studying more and more history, as I've been lately, I've been studying lots of World War I, World War II. There is nothing more politicized now that I'm finding that I'm older than history. And this is exactly what classical liberals have done. Yeah. They've used the same tactics that their progressive siblings have used against them in current times, Neil.
Yeah, because, modern leftists will attack the United States as going, well, it's a slave country. We built it on slaves, which is a half truth. It's a mischaracterization, okay? The entire country was not built on the backs of slaves, but we did have slavery, and that was a bad thing, right? But that being said, it's conservative, Protestant, whatever, who will look back at Christendom and characterize all of Christendom as, well, y'all just had slaves, you were abusing the Muslims, you were abusing Protestants, the Inquisition was slaughtering people left and right. There was millions of people killed by the Inquisition and blah, blah, blah. They exaggerate the bad in order to try and make them, the modern nations, specifically America, sound so righteous.
That's right.
And it's not a fair characterization.
Yeah, and we have examples of this, particularly with the Spanish Inquisition. For the longest time, we were told that millions of people died in the Spanish Inquisition. Then it changed to hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands. And then we find out it was about 2,000 people. And those people didn't even die in the Inquisition court. They died in the hands of the secular court system of the government at the time.
Yeah, the church never killed any of them.
Right.
They were just found guilty of heresy and handed over to the secular state. And it's the secular state that imposed the death penalty. And it didn't happen all that often. And on top of that, they were treated so well in the Inquisition courts, fairly, all right, that people would, in prison, profess to be a heretic in order to get thrown into the Inquisition court.
Yeah.
And then immediately find God.
And then they use the testimony of Protestants to build this historical narrative of how oppressive it was, the church during the time of the Inquisitions, which, what about that whole fair and balanced thing, right? Because there was clearly bias there, and we know that now historically. So this is why when leftists now attack American principles, I'm kind of like, I don't like it, but at the same time, I don't feel compelled to defend it, because it's like, listen, they're doing to you, classical liberals, what you did to us Catholics. You never gave us credit for anything. You never gave credit to Christendom, and all you did was slander and lie about what Christendom was. Now it's happening to you. All fair in love and war, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like I'm less inclined, maybe because I'm getting older, I don't know, but I'm less inclined to jump in and defend them, because I'm going, well, you got to do that to us.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. So, it's one of those things, and so with Mr. Beck, he won't acknowledge that he has this narrative in his mind and that he's built. And so, let's see here. So the other thing they talked about here is how the churches in America have failed and how Christianity is diminishing, Neil. Well, okay. But Glenn, you tell us that doctrine and dogma apparently doesn't matter to you.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the argument that Christianity is diminishing and churches are failing, generally speaking, when the ideas of religion failed, obviously we have man's fallen nature mixed up within that circumstance. But dogma matters, and what you believe matters. And so if you're watering down essential truths, especially, they kept talking about sin and repentance. And I'm thinking to myself, but You're Protestants. You guys are Protestants. You guys eliminated like half the sins and said sola fide, just have faith, Neil.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when he complains about the church, I go, okay, you're not exactly wrong in saying that.
Right.
The church has been weak, but it's your belief system that allows for that to happen.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's your belief system of, hey man, you live your life and we'll live our lives, and we won't actually live as like we believe the doctrines and dogmas of Jesus Christ. We're not going to live like that. Yeah, we believe it, but you don't have that kind of laissez-faire attitude is what has infiltrated the church. That kind of religious license and so forth has infiltrated the church, and that's the problem. So Glenn,
Yeah.
you're part of that problem because these are the things you support. And also he he tries to make Jesus often sound like a guy who just gives some good teachings, like principles. He always goes back to the word principles, and I'm like, Jesus taught more than just good principles. He wasn't only about that. He was about sin and salvation, heaven and hell. He was teaching us revelation, not just the opinion of a good teacher, as if these principles can be lined up with these other principles. And so like he's a philosopher, he's more than that.
Yeah. And it's interesting. They also touched on the idea of Christianity in the midst of this American kind of, I guess, mythos of sorts, because they just got done bashing the idea of Christian nationalism, but there's also this kind of adherence to this American mythos of how Christianity and America is kind of one and the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And it goes back to the notion of this whole, well, God gave us freedom as the most supreme commandments of them all, right? It's like we have 10 commandments and one commandment 1B is like to love your God, but commandment 1A is freedom and liberty, right? That's the kind of message I get from the Becks. And in that respect, they go on to, almost funny enough, make America sound like it was an integralist nation at its origins by its founding principles and its founding fathers. But at the same time, they don't call it that. It's like they apply it, they assume it, but they can't officially declare that. It's a very confusing, blurry position that they take, Neil.
Yeah, I think it goes back to his laissez-faire attitude about dogma and doctrine. It's like he can't say anything definite about anything.
Yeah.
He can't say, well, this is right, this is wrong, this is the way it ought to be, because that would be, you'd have to naturally restrict people in some way legally from doing certain things. And he can't see himself doing, I'm not saying everything needs to be restricted, by the way, but there are some things that can be addressed legally, and
Right.
he's not willing to take that step.
Yeah.
So he's laissez-faire about everything. He's kind of wishy-washy.
Yeah.
He's like, I see something wrong, but at the same time, there's nothing you can do about it, and so he goes off the rails with that.
Listen, I don't want to be too hard on Mr. Beck, but I'll be honest with you. I think Beck's ideas are dangerous, especially his ideas on religion and how he preaches it, especially this adherence to indifferentism and how he continues to preach this indifferentism. Neil, I was in the classical liberal camp, the conservative camp for, I don't know, call it 20 years roughly. I listened to a lot of talk radio on the right for many years. And I left about 10 years ago. And what I learned my time in that camp is virtually everything that these right-wing talkers actually talk about in the end, they're wrong, especially on religion. Mm-hmm. And it was always centered around the idea of indifferentism. Rush preached it, right? Hannity left the faith. Beck left the faith. He embraced indifferentism, right? I mean, you have a lot of, there's a few others out there. And what I've seen and what I fear is that the principles of the Enlightenment and ultimately America supersede Christianity. Is within the realm of this American idea of the Enlightenment that we're supposed to find our Christianity. And I would suggest that Christianity supersedes everything, including America. That's not to say we should not love our country and defend her. But when you have a nation like America that's gone really morally backward ass at this point in history, we have to begin to question everything, including the founding principles, including the basic dictates of everything we've known to be, because the country has gone perpetually to the left. And I believe is because they've separated the body politics from the theology. And the theology at one time and the roots of it that have a 2,000-year analogy of the faith is Christendom, is the Catholic Church. I know we have our problems in the church, and we could talk about that some other time. But I think the danger here from Mr. Beck is that not only is he a political talking head, but I think he's spiritually leading people off the proper road. And I hope that's not harsh. It's just the way I see it, Neil.
Well, he has this very individualistic outlook at Jesus and what he teaches and what he calls spirituality. It's all about the individual. And it's like Jesus, who is God, the Trinity, does in fact deal with the individual, but it's not to the exclusion of the general. It's not the exclusion of the people. How many times has the Israelites, the Jews, been punished as a people for the act of, say, the king or the priest who led them astray to worship false idols, or they found idols amongst some of the Jews in their tents, right? And what happened? They had to walk in the desert for 40 more years until that entire generation was killed off. A people was punished, not just the individuals who had the idols. All right. So it's not just about what you believe as the individual. Yes, that is important. It's vital. It's necessary. Okay. But it's not, how we would say in seminary, sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. It's not good enough. There's more to it than that. And for us as a people, it's the church. That's our people. It's more than just a religious institution. Like the Jews call themselves, we are a people. We are a people. The Catholics, we are a people. Right. And yes, how we act as individuals is important, but how we act as a people is important too. All right. And we can receive blessing or punishment as a result of that. And I believe a lot of this evil that's going on in the world, and specifically the United States, because that's my country, can be connected or correlated to the evil that's going on in the church, the watering down of the faith, the lack of strength to stand firm on the truth and preach it clearly and boldly. We've gone into this like modern apostasy, it seems like, where it's just everything's watered down at the very least.
Yeah.
Okay. If it's not outright apostasy, it's at least watered down with this nice psychobabble language that makes us feel good, you know?
Yeah.
So,
go
ahead.
I was just going to add, and I think America's fingerprints and its Enlightenment principles we have our fingerprints all over this apostasy, by the way.
Yeah.
Especially after, World War II, where we become the great moral leader of the world, and our influence is spread throughout all of the world, but Europe especially. And so it's like I told my friends on the right, and I continue to tell them, if you want to take credit for America's great economic success and its history of spreading freedom and liberty, because it's been the economic steam engine of the world, as many conservatives claim, fine, okay, America has brought prosperity. But if you're going to take credit for that, you also have to take blame that in that same time span, we've had the greatest moral collapse possibly since the flood of Noah, and the culture is a rotten pile of manure at this point. And so if we're going to, my question is this, fine, take your credit for your economic prosperity, if it's actually true prosperity. A lot of it's debt, to be honest with you, and money printing. But are you going to take the blame with America's influence and its paws all over it throughout the past century? Are you going to take the blame of what's happened to family and culture? We have to be consistent here, Neil. I'm going to give you the final word tonight.
Yeah, I think if you're going to take the good, you got to take the bad with it. And I realize no country is going to be perfect. And I'm not even saying that. I'm not even arguing for a perfect nation. I'm not saying, well, America could be the most bestest ever if they just adopted Catholicism. You know, we'd have the greatest outcomes in the world. It's not about outcome necessarily either. It's about what's right and what's true. Okay. It's about what has God asked of us. All right. And I believe a lot more good could come from that, but you're also going to have some bad too that comes with that too. It's not going to be a perfect country. But the fact is that Jesus said, go and baptize all nations, not just individuals, nations, people. And I feel like we've given up that command. We don't want to do that anymore. We want everyone to just do as they please, have this so-called freedom, which is license. And and it's to the point where Glenn himself and his guest there cannot define what is the church, right? Because if they're, and on top of it, if they do define it, then they are making themselves the founder of the church. It's their interpretation. It's their understanding of scripture. They've become the Pope now.
Yep.
So even if they could define it, they're now arguing against themselves because they just made themselves the Pope without Jesus giving them any authority for it. So I think unless we return to the way Jesus wanted us to do it, we're going to have more and more problems. But maybe I'm just a dreamer, I guess, because I mean, I know the United States is never going to be that way, but I'm still going to point out where it could improve and could be better. So.
Okay. All right, my friend. Very well said. Another great cast. I always love your thoughts on these issues, especially these spiritual issues that I think we really need to hear at this point in history. Your vlog site, Servants of the Sacred Fire. Now, you just got that site up, right?
Yeah, I just got it up. I think I have 2 videos that have up now. A third one's coming up next week. I got them separated by one comes out each week. But so far, I mean, I've only did a couple of opinion things. Right. Mostly doing the Baltimore Catechism right now.
All right, fair enough. Well, me and Neil are going to be doing a bunch of casts here, frankly speaking. I'm sure I'll join him over on his site as well, too, pretty soon. And my friend, I want to thank you for joining me. Another great conversation. I know it seems like we're picking on Mr. Beck a lot. I know I've been accused of having a vendetta against Glenn Beck. So,
but he just makes it so easy, though.
It's so nonsensical half the time. It's so easy and really fun in many ways because while I don't dislike Mr. Beck at all, I just don't think a lot of times he is the sharpest tool in the shed. Let's put it that way.
Well, if it makes Glenn Beck feel any better, I much more dislike Sean Hannity.
There you go. I agree with you, actually.
I have much more dislike for him because of his public claim of I was in seminary. Okay, well then you should know better, so I have less mercy for you.
I don't even listen to Hannity. I just find it's cringe. It's so cringe, to be honest with you. All right. Thank you, my friend, for joining me tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us, being our audience here. We really appreciate the time you spend here with us. This is Frank. I want to thank my friend Neil once again for joining me tonight. Signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.